The courtroom was packed. You could feel the tension in the air. All eyes were fixed on a single man standing tall at the front, his dark skin contrasting sharply with the clean white walls behind him. This was Jonathan Reeves, a black attorney with a reputation for winning even the toughest cases. Today, however, the challenge wasn't just the case itself, it was who he was defending. Across from him sat Sarah Mitchell, a quiet, unassuming woman in her mid-30s, with pale skin and nervous eyes. Sarah had been accused of a crime that had divided the community. The case had quickly become a symbol of something much bigger than her individual guilt or innocence. For some, it was a story of justice. For others, it was a tale of racial tension and societal expectations. Jonathan had been criticized for taking on this case, with many questioning his choice to defend Sarah, a black lawyer, defending a white woman in a case that seemed so open and shut. People wondered what motivated him. Was it just another job, or was there something deeper at play? Some even whispered that he was betraying his own community. But Jonathan wasn't one to let the opinions of others cloud his judgment. To him, the facts were what mattered, and the truth needed to be found. As Jonathan rose to deliver his opening statement, the room fell into complete silence. Everyone knew that this moment could shift the direction of the entire trial. He cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice calm but commanding. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today, we are not here to focus on race, prejudice, or societal pressure. We are here to find the truth, and that is what I intend to uncover." His words hung in the air, challenging every preconceived notion that people had brought into the courtroom with them. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she listened, unsure if even her own lawyer believed in her. She had kept secrets that could change everything if they came to light. As the trial unfolded, Jonathan's dedication to Sarah's defense became clearer. He wasn't just there to win, he was there to challenge the narrative, to question everything that everyone thought they knew about the case. But Sarah wasn't making it easy. She was holding back, and Jonathan knew it. He could sense that she was hiding something that could either make or break her defense. What was Sarah not telling him? And why, after everything he had risked by taking this case, was she refusing to trust him completely? Just as Jonathan was beginning to piece together the puzzle, Sarah leaned over to him during a brief recess. Her voice was barely a whisper, but her words were enough to send a chill down his spine. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and regret. Jonathan's heart raced as he realized that this revelation could change everything. Everything he thought he knew about the case, and maybe even his belief in Sarah's innocence. What Sarah revealed next left Jonathan stunned, questioning whether he had been fighting for the right cause all along. And what she would do after the trial, no one could have predicted. Stay tuned for part 2, where the truth will unravel, and the consequences of Sarah's choices will leave everyone speechless. Jonathan could hardly breathe as Sarah's words echoed in his mind. His eyes scanned her face, searching for any sign that she might be lying. But what he saw was fear, genuine, raw fear. She sat back in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes darting nervously around the room as though someone might be watching. For the first time since he took on the case, Jonathan felt a pang of doubt creep into his chest. He had been certain, almost to the point of arrogance, that he could prove Sarah's innocence. He had studied the evidence, reviewed every witness statement, and scrutinized the details of her story over and over again. It had all seemed so clear, so black and white, but now he wasn't so sure. "What do you mean?" Jonathan whispered, leaning in closer so no one could overhear. The courtroom recess was short, and they didn't have much time. Sarah swallowed hard, her eyes flickering with hesitation. She opened her mouth to speak but quickly closed it again, as if the words were too dangerous to say out loud. Jonathan's frustration grew. He had put everything on the line to defend her, and now she was backing out at most critical moment. "Sarah," he urged, his voice low but firm. "If you don't tell me what's going on, I can't help you. What is it? What are you hiding?" She glanced up at him, her pale face even whiter under the harsh courtroom lights. "It's not what you think," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's more to this, so much more. I didn't mean for things to get this far. But now I can't stop it." Jonathan frowned, confusion clouding his thoughts. Stop what? What had she started that couldn't be undone? "And in your investigation, did you find any evidence that linked the defendant, Sarah Mitchell, to the crime?" Jonathan's heart raced as he listened, his mind racing through the possibilities. He knew this was where the prosecution would try to seal the deal, where they would attempt to paint Sarah as guilty beyond a shadow of a doubt. But Jonathan wasn't ready to let that happen, not yet. Price nodded again, his gaze shifting slightly as he responded. "Yes, we found evidence that placed Sarah Mitchell at the scene of the crime." Margaret nodded, her expression smug as she continued. "And what was that evidence, Detective?" Price hesitated for a split second before answering. "We found fingerprints that matched Sarah's on several key pieces of evidence." The courtroom murmured, the weight of Price's words sinking in. But Jonathan wasn't convinced. Something felt off. Price was too hesitant, too careful in his wording. He had been confident, almost cocky, during the pre-trial interviews. But now, there was a nervousness in his eyes that Jonathan hadn't seen before. Jonathan stood, his voice calm as he addressed the detective. "Detective Price, you said you found fingerprints that matched my clients on several pieces of evidence. Can you tell the court what those pieces of evidence were?" Price cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "We found her prints on the door handle, the victim's phone, and a kitchen knife that was found at the scene." Jonathan nodded, as if processing the information, but inside, his mind was racing. He had seen the evidence list. The knife had been dismissed as irrelevant early on in the investigation. Why was Price bringing it up now? Was he trying to mislead the jury, or was there something more going on here? "Detective Price," Jonathan continued, his voice steady, "wasn't it true that the knife found at the scene was determined to be unrelated to the crime?" Price hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Margaret before he answered. "That was the initial conclusion, yes, but further analysis suggested that it might have been used." Jonathan raised an eyebrow, sensing a crack in the detective's composure. "Might have been used," he repeated, his tone skeptical. "Or was used?" Price shifted again, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the questioning was taking. "We can't say for certain," he admitted reluctantly. Jonathan glanced at the jury, hoping they were catching on to the detective's uncertainty. It was a small victory, but he wasn't done yet. "Detective Price," Jonathan said, his voice firm, "isn't it true that no DNA evidence was found on that knife?" Price's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Jonathan thought he might refuse to answer. But finally, he nodded. "Yes, that's true." The tension in the room grew as Jonathan pressed forward, sensing an opening. "So, if there's no DNA evidence, and no definitive proof that the knife was used in the crime, why are we even discussing it?" Price's eyes narrowed, his frustration evident, but he remained silent. Jonathan turned to the jury, letting his question linger in the air. Detective Price's silence was deafening. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Jonathan could sense the shift in the room. There was doubt now, a seed of uncertainty that hadn't been there moments before. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he had cracked something open. But before he could push any further, Margaret Wilkins was back on her feet. "Objection, Your Honor," she said, her voice clipped. "Defense is attempting to mislead the jury with irrelevant details. The knife may not have DNA, but it was still found at the scene, and it is not the defense's place to discount it so quickly." Jonathan kept his eyes on the jury. Margaret was trying to regain control, but they had seen Price falter. They had seen his hesitation, and Jonathan hoped that was enough to keep their minds open, at least for now. "Withdrawn," Jonathan said, sitting back down as the judge nodded in agreement. He didn't need to fight this particular battle any longer. He had planted the doubt he needed. But as he glanced at Sarah, who was nervously wringing her hands again, he couldn't help but feel uneasy. There was still so much she hadn't told him, and time was running out. As the prosecution wrapped up with Detective Price, Jonathan's mind raced. He had to figure out what Sarah was hiding, and fast. Something in Price's testimony wasn't adding up, and if Sarah had any hope of walking out of this courtroom a free woman, Jonathan needed to get the full picture. When the court recessed again, Jonathan wasted no time. He led Sarah out of the courtroom, finding a quiet corner where they could speak privately. Her eyes were wide with anxiety, and she glanced over her shoulder as if she expected someone to be watching. "Sarah," Jonathan said, his voice firm but gentle, "I need you to be honest with me." "I trust you," she said softly. "But please be careful. They're dangerous." Jonathan nodded, his mind already racing with plans. He would need to gather evidence, real evidence that could prove Sarah's claims, and he would need to do it fast. Time was running out, and the forces working against them were powerful. As they parted ways for the evening, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That man in the courtroom, who was he? Was he part of this conspiracy? Jonathan knew he had to stay sharp, had to keep one step ahead if they were going to have any chance of winning this fight. The next morning, Jonathan arrived at his office early, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. He pulled out his phone and called a trusted investigator he had worked with on previous cases. If anyone could help him dig into Detective Price's past and uncover the truth, it was this man. "I need you to look into someone for me," Jonathan said, his voice low as he spoke into the phone. "Detective Alan Price. And there's someone else too, a man who was in the courtroom yesterday. I need to know who he is and why he's there." The investigator promised to get back to him as soon as possible, and Jonathan hung up, his mind spinning with possibilities. If Price was involved in framing Sarah, there had to be a reason, something they were trying to cover up. But before Jonathan could follow that line of thought, his phone buzzed again. It was a text message from an unknown number. The message was short, but the meaning was clear. "Stop digging. You won't like what you find." Jonathan's blood ran cold. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore, it was personal. And now, whoever was behind this knew he was getting too close to the truth. But instead of scaring him off, the message only strengthened his resolve. He was going to find out the truth, no matter the cost. Jonathan stared at his phone, the threatening message lingering in his mind. He knew he was in deep now, but turning back wasn't an option. Whoever had sent that text had underestimated his determination. He had come too far, and Sarah's life was on the line. His investigator would need time to dig into Price and the man from the courtroom, but Jonathan didn't have the luxury of waiting. He had to keep moving, and every second counted. The next day in court, the tension was palpable. Jonathan could feel eyes on him, not just from the jury, but from the man in the back of the room. The same man who had been there the previous day, watching Sarah with that cold, calculating stare. Jonathan's instincts told him this man was a key player in the conspiracy. But without proof, he was just another face in the crowd. As the prosecution rested its case, it was Jonathan's turn to present the defense. He had spent the night going over every detail, every shred of evidence, and every witness statement. But there was still one crucial piece missing, something to tie everything together. "Your Honor," Jonathan said as he stood before the court, "the defense calls Sarah Johnson to the stand." Sarah looked terrified, but Jonathan gave her a reassuring nod. This was the moment of truth. She had to tell her story, all of it. As she took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. The jurors leaned in, eager to hear from the woman at the center of the trial. Jonathan approached her, his voice calm and steady. "Sarah," he began, "I know this is difficult, but I need you to tell the court everything you know about what happened that night." Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting nervously toward the man in the back of the room. Jonathan saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else, resolve. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "It was late," she said, her voice shaky at first. "I was supposed to meet with the victim, Jack Evans. He called me that day, said he had something important to discuss, something about a business deal. I didn't know what it was, but he sounded desperate." Jonathan nodded, encouraging her to continue. "When I got there, everything seemed normal at first, but then Jack started talking about how he was in trouble, big trouble. He said he had made a deal with some people he shouldn't have trusted. He didn't give me all the details, but I could tell he was scared." Jonathan could see the jury hanging on her every word. This was new information, something they hadn't heard before. "And then what happened?" Jonathan asked, his voice soft but insistent. "Then, he told me that the deal had gone bad. He was supposed to pay them back, but he didn't have the money. He said they were coming for him, that they would kill him if he didn't come up with the cash." Sarah's voice broke, and she wiped away a tear. "I didn't know what to do. I wanted to help him, but before I could even process what was happening, there was a knock at the door. Jack looked at me, panicked, and told me to hide. He said they were here." Jonathan's heart raced. This was it, the moment everything changed. "Who was at the door, Sarah?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She looked down, her hands trembling. "It was Detective Price," she said quietly. "And the man sitting in the back of this courtroom." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Jonathan felt a surge of adrenaline. He had been right all along, but there was more. There had to be more. "What happened next?" Jonathan asked, his voice steady. "Jack tried to talk to them," Sarah continued, her voice trembling. "He told them he was working on getting the money, but they didn't care. They started arguing, and I could hear things getting physical. I was hiding in the other room, terrified. I didn't know what to do." Jonathan stepped closer. "Did you see what happened to Jack?" Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I saw it all. They killed him. Detective Price and that man. They killed him." The courtroom erupted in chaos. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was done. The jury had heard everything. Jonathan stood there, watching as the weight of Sarah's words sank in. But there was still one piece missing, something Jonathan had been waiting for. And then, as if on cue, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from his investigator. "I found something. Check your email." Jonathan quickly excused himself from the courtroom, stepping outside to check his phone. His investigator had sent him a file, a recording. Jonathan's heart raced as he hit play. It was Detective Price's voice, clear as day, talking to the man from the courtroom. "I don't care what you have to do," Price said in the recording. "Make sure she goes down for this. We can't have any loose ends." Jonathan couldn't believe what he was hearing. This was it, the proof he needed. He rushed back into the courtroom, his heart pounding. "Your Honor," he said, interrupting the proceedings, "I have new evidence that directly implicates Detective Price and the man in the back of this courtroom in the murder of Jack Evans." The judge looked skeptical, but Jonathan played the recording for the court. The moment Price's voice filled the room, the tension skyrocketed. The jury's eyes widened, and even the judge looked shocked. The man in the back of the room stood up, his face pale, and bolted for the door. But before he could escape, the bailiffs were on him, dragging him back into the courtroom. Price, sitting in the witness box, looked as though he had seen a ghost. He knew the game was up. The courtroom was in chaos once again, but Jonathan stood calmly in the center, knowing he had finally uncovered the truth. The trial wasn't about Sarah's guilt or innocence anymore. It was about exposing the corruption that had led to Jack's death. As the dust settled, Jonathan looked over at Sarah, who was still trembling but now had a look of relief on her face. The nightmare was finally over, or so they thought. Just as the judge was about to call for a recess, something unexpected happened. The man from the back of the courtroom, now in handcuffs, smirked. "You think this is over?" he said, his voice cold and mocking. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Jonathan's stomach dropped. There was more, something even darker lurking beneath the surface. Before he could respond, the man was dragged out of the courtroom, his laughter echoing in Jonathan's ears. The trial had ended, but the mystery was far from resolved. Jonathan knew that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The conspiracy that had taken Jack's life and nearly ruined Sarah's was still out there, and they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. As Sarah was acquitted and the courtroom emptied, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched. The people behind this, whoever they were, wouldn't let this go easily. The story had reached its climax, but the real battle was just beginning. Jonathan walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the case still heavy on his shoulders. The air outside felt different, lighter, but not in the way he had hoped. There was a certain unease that lingered, an unresolved tension that gnawed at him. He had cleared Sarah's name, exposed Detective Price, and brought the man in the back of the courtroom to justice, or at least, it seemed that way. But something still didn't sit right. That smirk, those last words, "You have no idea what you're dealing with." As Sarah stood beside him, a wave of relief washed over her. She was free. But Jonathan could tell from the way she held herself that she wasn't completely at peace. After everything she had gone through, it would take time to heal. The lies, the threats, the trial, it had all taken a toll on her, but she was resilient. She had shown that time and again. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice soft but sincere. Jonathan shook his head. "You don't have to. This isn't over yet, Sarah. There's still more to uncover, and until we do, you're not completely safe." Sarah's expression shifted, a flicker of fear returning to her eyes. "You think they're still out there, even after everything?" Jonathan glanced over his shoulder, scanning the street as if expecting someone to be watching. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were. "Yes," he replied quietly. "There's more to this than what we saw in that courtroom." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The truth of his words hung between them, undeniable. The trial might be over, but the real danger wasn't. That night, Jonathan returned to his office, unable to sleep. He pored over the evidence again, trying to piece together the bigger picture. Price had been working for someone. There was no doubt about that. But who? And why had they been so intent on framing Sarah? He thought about Jack Evans, the victim, and the deal he had mentioned to Sarah that night. It was all connected, but the final piece was still missing. As the hours passed, Jonathan's phone buzzed. A new email. He opened it, his heart pounding as he read the contents. It was from his investigator. The subject line was short but chilling. More corruption in the department. Inside the email was a list of names, high-ranking officials, people in power who had been pulling the strings all along. And at the very top of that list was a name Jonathan never expected. Judge Matthews. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. The very judge who had presided over Sarah's trial, the one who had seemed so impartial, so above it all, was part of the conspiracy. The pieces started to fall into place. This wasn't just about Jack's murder. It was bigger than that, much bigger. It was about power, control, and silencing anyone who got in the way. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had exposed part of the corruption, but now he knew it went all the way to the top. The trial had been just the beginning. And now, with Judge Matthews involved, he realized how deep the danger ran. The next few weeks were a blur. Jonathan and his investigator worked tirelessly to gather more evidence, slowly pulling at the threads of the conspiracy. Every lead took them deeper into a web of lies, corruption, and deceit. More names emerged, more connections between the people involved. It was a network, carefully constructed and hidden from the public eye. Sarah, meanwhile, tried to move on with her life. She had been cleared of the charges, and the media had finally backed off. But she still lived with the constant fear that someone was watching her. She kept in touch with Jonathan, and he assured her that they were doing everything they could to bring the people responsible to justice. But Sarah knew, deep down, that she might never truly be free. And then, just when Jonathan thought they had hit a dead end, a breakthrough came. His investigator found a witness, someone who had worked closely with Judge Matthews and had seen firsthand the dirty dealings that had been going on behind the scenes. The witness was willing to testify, but there was a catch. They wanted protection. Jonathan arranged a meeting in a quiet, out-of-the-way diner. The witness, a former court clerk named David, looked nervous as he slid into the booth across from Jonathan. "I don't know if I should be doing this," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "These people, they don't play around." Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes locking onto David's. "If you don't, they'll keep getting away with it. We can't let that happen." David nodded, but Jonathan could see the fear in his eyes. "I was in the room when Matthews took the bribe," David confessed. "It was all arranged. Price, the other guy, Jack Evans, they were all part of it. Matthews wanted Jack silenced because he knew too much." Jonathan felt a surge of anger. Jack's death had been orchestrated by people who were supposed to uphold the law, and Sarah had nearly paid the price for their greed. But why frame Sarah? Jonathan asked, needing to understand the full picture. They needed a scapegoat, David explained. Someone who wasn't connected to their operation. Sarah was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Jonathan clenched his fists under the table. It was all so senseless. Sarah had been dragged into a deadly game but had nothing to do with her, all because she had known Jack. With David's testimony, Jonathan finally had what he needed. The pieces of the puzzle had come together, and now it was time to act. Over the next few weeks, Jonathan built his case, gathering every scrap of evidence he could find. When the day finally came to confront Judge Matthews, Jonathan felt a sense of justice that he hadn't felt in a long time. Matthews had tried to run, but the law had finally caught up with him. In the end, the conspiracy was exposed, and the people responsible were held accountable. Price, Matthews, and the others involved were arrested, and Sarah was finally free from the shadow that had loomed over her for so long. But as Jonathan stood outside the courthouse, watching the sunset, he knew that justice didn't always feel like victory. There were still scars on Sarah, on the families affected, and on himself. The fight for the truth had been long and painful, and the cost had been high. He thought about Jack Evans, the man who had tried to escape the grip of corruption, but had paid with his life. He thought about Sarah, who had lost so much but had gained her freedom. And he thought about the system that had allowed such corruption to fester. Jonathan knew that his work wasn't over. There would always be more cases, more corruption to expose, more people like Sarah who needed someone to stand by their side. But for now, he could take a moment to breathe, knowing that justice had been served. As he walked to his car, his phone buzzed. Another case, another client in need of help. Jonathan smiled to himself. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready for whatever came next. And so, the story came to a close, not with a final resolution, but with the understanding that life is full of battles. Some we win, some we lose, but all of them shape us. Jonathan had fought for Sarah, for Jack, and for the truth. And in the end, that fight was all that mattered.